David Miliband is President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, where he oversees the agency's humanitarian relief operations in more than 40 war-affected countries and its refugee settlements and assistance programs in 26 United States cities. Please, let's give Mr. Miliband a great welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Petra. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be with you today, because across this room, I see people who represent so much that is not just valuable but important in America. Pride in the ideals of the country, commitment to others, and openness to the world. And we at the International Rescue Committee are proud to share common cause with you. I only wish I could be here with you for longer this afternoon, but I'm afraid I've got an appointment in New York at 5:30, and so I hope you'll excuse me if I duck out of this meeting straight after my remarks. But I did want to come here today because we're meeting at a very important moment, not just in the United States, but around the world. I don't think it's too much to say that this is a tumultuous period for the people that our organizations serve. There are more people on the move than ever before in every continent of the world. There are more threats to the safety of these people than ever before, from people, smugglers, seeking to make a profit, from armed groups seeking to rule by terror, and sometimes from governments who are ready to abuse their own citizens. There is more political polarization than ever before about whether, as well as how, to help the groups that we seek to support. Not just in Europe and North America, but there is political polarization too in Kenya, in Pakistan, and in Lebanon. And as the scale and the scope of the challenge that we face becomes larger and more complex, there is amongst the public more confusion about the right policy response. And that's why I think it's the right time for groups that have traditionally represented refugees and immigrants separately to come together and find common cause. In my experience, it's at times of political polarization that non-governmental organizations, that civil society, is ever more important. Important to see above the clamor and stand up for what is right. Important to establish sound principles for action. Important to defend core values. And important to put the needs of people first, to provide genuinely practical solutions rather than just rhetoric. So in my remarks today, over the next 15 or 20 minutes, I just want to do the following. First of all, to thank all of you in the immigrant rights communities who have come together to support us in defending the services that we provide to refugees over the last year or two. In Texas, in the states that have tried to pass anti-refugee legislation, we have come together and we have beaten them back. Secondly, I want to try and explain what we are seeing in our humanitarian work in 30 to 35 countries around the world, where we work in war zones, in fragile states, on the refugee transit routes. What is it that's driving more people to seek their safety outside their own homes and outside their own country? Thirdly, to defend the need for US leadership here at home in preserving and strengthening the system of rights and responsibilities that protects vulnerable people, whether they are resettled refugees or asylum seekers, dreamers or unaccompanied children, and families from Central America. And fourthly, to argue that although there are distinctive characteristics of these groups, needs and legal protections need to be available to different populations that we serve, making sense for us to forge links across traditional boundaries and sectors, trying to defend vulnerable people. Let me just start with a short word about the history of the IRC, because I think it speaks to the current situation. We were founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to rescue Jews from Europe. In the 1960s, we expanded our work to help Cubans fleeing for America. In the 1990s, we expanded our work again to the former Yugoslavia, becoming a humanitarian organization in the front line of crisis. And now we work across the global arc of crisis, from war zones like Syria and Yemen, to fragile states like Jordan and Pakistan, to refugee transit routes like Greece and Niger. And we work also in the United States in 29 cities, resettling around 13,300 refugees last year. And as the demand for the services that we offer refugees has grown from other groups, particularly vulnerable populations, we have been proud to expand our services in tandem. In the last 5 years, we're proud to have helped over 23,000 immigrants naturalize as US citizens, assist 2,500 individuals with TPS to apply for reunification with their children through the Central American Minor Resettlement Program, and assisted many more immigrants with family reunification and legal permanent residence. Since the start of the DACA program, we have assisted around 1,000 young dreamers to obtain deferred action. And nearly 1 in 3 of the 37,000 clients we helped in the US with our economic self-sufficiency, financial literacy, English as a second language, or youth services programs, nearly a third did not arrive through the refugee resettlement route. So for us, the work we do for 37,000 people in the US and the work we do for 23 million people around the world receiving humanitarian provision, they represent 2 wings of the work that we do. But we wanted to be here at this conference out of a recognition that the neat boundaries that dominated law and practice in the last century don't fit the realities of this century. Organizations with their origins in helping refugees and groups founded to help immigrants need to work together, not just because the needs of vulnerable groups overlap, not just because the public are confused about the distinctions, not just because of shared fears that all of us hear every day from would-be immigrants and from would-be refugees, but also because of the shared principles that we defend. Above all, the right of human beings to protection in the face of serious harm. And I want to focus my remarks today on what the future holds here in the United States, but I think it's worth having a global perspective, and I was asked to provide one. Around the world, more people are fleeing violence than ever before. 25 million refugees and 40 million internally displaced. That figure of 65 million would be the world's 21st largest country if they were grouped together. 24 people every minute displaced from their homes by violence last year. But the inherited assumptions of the last century don't fit the situation of those displaced people. Most refugees are not in camps, they're in cities. Most displaced people are not evacuated for a short time, but for a long time. In fact, the majority don't go home. Millions of people are stateless, being born in countries where they have no entitlement to citizenship because they are the sons and daughters of refugees, while those living under the rule of non-state groups like ISIS or Daesh find themselves similarly without the protection of a legitimate state. So in our work around the world, we call for a breakdown in the divide between development work and humanitarian work. And so it seems appropriate to recognize, at a time when we're calling for a breakdown in the divide here at home in the United States, it seems appropriate to recognize that in some aspects of global protection, the US has good claim to be a world leader. For around 1/5 of 1% of national US income, the work of international humanitarian and development aid from the US achieves quite remarkable results, improving education for 12 million kids, responding to 49 humanitarian emergencies in 45 countries. This is work that embodies some core strengths of the American ideal: compassion, justice, a hand up, not just a hand out. And so at the same time as arguing for a continuation of that American international leadership, I think it's important to send a message from this conference about US domestic leadership. Because the truth is, when the US Agency for International Development says it wants to uphold the dignity of people terrorized by ISIS by supporting them in the Middle East, it carries more force when some of the neediest cases are offered refuge a home here in the US, in San Diego, or elsewhere. When the Office of US Federal Disaster Assistance brings care to children chased from their homes by Boko Haram in Nigeria, it carries moral weight when children chased from their homes in Honduras are protected and given care in Phoenix. And when the US urges successful integration of refugees in Europe, they are listened to more seriously when asylum seekers and other newcomers to American communities are treated with dignity and with due process. I can tell you that the best of US policy in protecting vulnerable children and adults here at home is core to the story and the ideals in which this country is held in great respect around the world. The rights to equal treatment, the commitment not to discriminate, the determination to uphold human dignity are what have provided a haven for generations, but at their best, they're also the foundation of global stability, security, and example. So the case that I think comes out from this conference is not just a moral case, it's also a practical one. The protections offered to vulnerable people here that need to be defended are not only an example to the world, they've also been good for America, and we shouldn't hesitate to say so. The case for the social and economic benefit of policies for protection and welcome, as well as the national security arguments, need to be made more clearly and more effectively than ever, because the truth is they can reinforce each other. We're all preparing for the consequences of the election result. For some, policy directions have been clearly signaled. For others, the field is more open. Different organizations will want to use different tactics to represent different groups. We are not, at the IRC, a political organization, and our obligation is to bring our experience to the attention of policymakers and to the public without fear or favor. But as we wait for the new administration to take office, I see three critical components to an effective response from the people who share the values that we do in this room. I just want to go through them. The first is that we need to be clear about the principles that we stand on. Principles like the following: that safe haven is necessary both for refugees who are resettled from third countries and those who flee and claim asylum here, because these two sets of protections are two sides of the same coin. Principles like the following: that the protection of the most vulnerable starts with protecting children and keeping families together, because we judge and we shouldn't hesitate to say this to those who attack our position. We judge the strength of a society by how it protects the most vulnerable. And there are few more vulnerable than young children, but also because the primacy of the family as the principal unit within society is not just a moral value, but it's actually enshrined in international treaties and therefore a legal obligation as well as a moral one. Principles like the following: that every individual is entitled to equal protection and due process that takes account of their individual circumstances, whatever their race or their religion, because that's a founding tenet of the rule of law in this country. The principle that naturalization for those who qualify is important not just because it benefits that individual, but because it benefits America's economy and its social cohesion. The principle that legal routes to enter the country are essential, because without them, the criminal networks are all that desperate people have to turn from. And if you want to see the danger of what happens when there are no legal routes to hope, just look at the 4,300 deaths in the Mediterranean over the last year, and you will see the consequence when there is no legal route to protection. It's right, too, that those who have served this country by working with US forces in Afghanistan and Iraq deserve to be admitted here under the SIV program, because they put their lives in danger for this country and they have earned reciprocal help. And those principles, those 6 principles, benefit not from being applied selectively, but from being applied comprehensively and rigorously, in order to preserve American leadership in the face of today's challenges. None of these principles dispute the existence or the relevance or the importance of national borders. They insist instead that the maintenance of those borders should be done in a way which respects human dignity. We should be the people saying that protection for the most vulnerable and national security, far from being incompatible, are both necessary and are mutually reinforcing. The second point I want to make to you is that we need to set out the facts about the US situation. If you open a newspaper, you'll hear a lot of talk about a post-fact world. We should not accept that we are going to live in a post-fact world. It's our job to make sure that the old lie that an untruth is halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on does not actually become the reality. You know the facts about immigration better than I, but far too few people know the facts about refugees. Fact: the countries bearing the greatest strain from the recent displacement of people around the world, notably from Syria, are not countries like the US or countries in Europe. They're countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Fact: it's harder to get into the US as a refugee than through any other legal route. The security screening involves 12 to 15 government agencies, and the process takes 18 to 24 months. Fact: refugees start their life in America with a debt to repay the government for the cost of their travel. And federal benefits last for 90 days. Now, I know that is more than many immigrants are able to receive themselves. But only a minimum safety net can that be considered for families whose lives have been shattered by war and violence. Facts, of course, are worthless if they are not believed. Still worse is for them to be dismissed as propaganda or replaced as myths. And we bear a special responsibility to dispel the myths. And that leads to the third point I want to make to you, and it's our third big challenge. We need to work together in a way that builds our coalition and reframes the public argument, away from the statistics which can dehumanize people and towards the stories which show the true needs they have and the value of the work that we do. There's a lot in the newspapers today about Russia. And there's one Russian who I very rarely quote, but in this case, it's true, and it's worth quoting. Joseph Stalin said, that one person's death is a tragedy, 1 million people's death is a statistic. Now, the danger for us is that the figure of 11 million, that many of you will know, or the figure of 25 million, which is the number of refugees, or the figure of 65 million, which is the number of displaced people, the great danger is that we lose the human side in those numbers and in those statistics. And the power of the partnership that we can offer can be seen when we do work together. 51 out of 52 state legislative bills to roll back refugee rights were not held at bay by accident. They were held back by new forms of organization and new forms of mobilization across traditional lines by the organizations represented in this room. And in truth, we don't just need to slap ourselves on the back and congratulate each other. We need to do more, and we need to do better together. We need to give voice to refugees and to immigrants themselves, explaining through their stories the contributions that they make to this country and the commitment they share to its core values. We need to organize at local level so that the compassionate, open, warm, humane welcome that many Americans want to give to refugees and immigrants, to unaccompanied kids and to others, is shown to policymakers. And actually, I was hearing just before this lunch, the lunch that you're having, that I'm not having, but I was hearing just before about some extraordinary work here in Tennessee that has turned around a situation of real animus and disdain and turned it into a much more welcoming environment. That's the kind of local mobilization that is important. And we also need to mobilize the multitude of success stories, the extraordinary people who become business leaders and sports leaders and medical leaders and academic leaders, but also the ordinary stories of people who are doing that toughest of job, which is to just be a productive and patriotic member of society. We've got to mobilize those stories as well. And I hope that by coming together in this conference, we don't just understand each other better, we don't just learn from each other more, but we come out of here clearer about the difference that we need to make together for the people that we serve. People sometimes ask me whether this is a challenging or difficult time to be leading the International Rescue Committee. And I have to say to you that my answer is always the same. It's nowhere near as challenging as it is for the people outside this country seeking safety, or the people in this country fearful for their safety. My job is easy compared to the lives that they lead. The great danger of our current situation is that in the midst of all the statistics that I've mentioned, the human stories are lost. Our job is to bring those stories to the fore, because they are the stories of successive waves of people who have come to this country. First to be met by concern, then with discrimination, then with tolerance, then with respect, and then eventually with admiration. The dentists who we are helping from Aleppo, the runner from South Sudan, the student from Honduras, they are following in the footsteps of the leather worker fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, the agricultural worker fleeing famine in Ireland, the factory worker seeking a better life from Italy. They are the people who want to survive and thrive by making a better life and show enormous courage to give themselves and their children a chance to do so. I believe it's our duty to cherish their stories, cherish their ideals, and burnish the idea that this is a country that values that kind of commitment. By being here today, I wanted to commit my organization to being part of that struggle, and I look forward to working with you in the years ahead. Thank you very much indeed.